murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound, and
Psycho is the 1960 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and it's starring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh. A woman named Marion is on the lam after stealing $40,000 from her employer. She runs away to the Bates Motel, where she finds a very polite Norman Bates, who has a very complicated relationship with his mother. I'm pretty sure most people know the movie Psycho, and obviously if you do know it, then you know how influential it is on the horror genre. I could probably do a whole video essay on just the shower scene in this movie. Everyone knows that scene, and everyone knows that music. The ring, ring, ring. I love seeing the behind the scenes and seeing the history of this movie upon its initial release, because people were actually so scared that they were running out of the theaters. They just couldn't handle it. The reasons why audiences had such a visceral reaction to this movie is because this movie really pushed the boundaries at the time, not only for its violence shown on screen, but its sexual implications that are shown on screen. If you know this movie, you know there's a lot of risque things in it. For example, the opening scene of this movie has Janet Leigh and her boyfriend in a state of undress, implying that they just had sex, and audiences at the time were not used to seeing that. We also see Janet Leigh implied to be fully naked in the shower, which was also not something that was just shown in a movie. Hitchcock actually had a knack for pushing past the Hays Code in his filmmaking career, and sometimes even giving the middle finger to the studios and being like, I'm Alfred Hitchcock, bitches, this is my movie. An example of that would be that during that time period, there was a rule that kisses in films could only be like 3 seconds long. At least that's what I read somewhere. And the way that Hitchcock would bypass that would be, there was actually a movie he did where two characters were kissing, right? And then one of the characters would go grab a phone and then talk on the phone and then go back to kissing and then go back to the phone and then go back to kissing and back to the phone, back to kissing. And that was a way where he could have a longer version of the kiss but broken up in different increments to kind of be like, you know, give the finger to the Hays Code. Obviously this film is pretty tame compared to the movies we see today. The violence and sex shown on screen is pretty minimal, and it's honestly pretty much mostly implied. It's all about the implication for Hitchcock. Audiences at that time were losing their minds over this movie. Hitchcock pushed the envelope, and without him, without this movie, the horror genre would not be the same today. And that's why this is a huge stepping stone for the history of horror. So Psycho isn't actually my favorite Hitchcock movie, Rear Window is, but most of the time Hitchcock only did suspense or thrillers, and this is more so a horror movie, so that's why I had to talk about it. Janet Leigh gives such a great performance in this movie, filled with anxiety and guilt. Hitchcock and Janet Leigh had such a good working relationship for this movie, as opposed to a lot of the actresses that Hitchcock worked with in the past who had said that he was crude or terrible to them in their treatment. But him and Janet Leigh, he actually respected her, and she also respected him for the results he was able to pull out of his actors and what he could put on screen for the audiences. Frankly, every actor in this movie brings their A game, but no one brings it to the level that Anthony Perkins does.
She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
Anthony Perkins has a really tough task of trying to balance these two split personalities. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Psycho, it's been out for a long time, and I'm assuming that if you're watching this review right now that you've probably seen the movie. But Anthony Perkins is playing Norman Bates, right? But he's also playing the role of his psychotic mother. I remember when I saw this movie for the first time in middle school, and being actually really surprised when you find out at the end that Norman Bates was the killer the whole time. It's almost like finding out that Bruce Willis was dead at the end of Sixth Sense. you go back and then you rewatch the movie multiple times and you realize, oh my god, that totally makes sense. Like, how did I not see that? It becomes so clear for you that it makes the further rewatches more enjoyable. He's having whole conversations with himself and she has no idea because he's up there and then comes down, and it's just super clever. I always really enjoy the opening titles for a Hitchcock movie because they always feel super unique for the time. The fact that they decided to shoot in black and white is also a really great choice because it makes the movie feel old and classic, but making it timeless at the same time. The music, also a banger, especially in the shower scene. I read a book on the psychology of Hitchcock, and it's just so interesting to compare what I read to his films, going back to rewatch like The Birds, The Rear Window, or Psycho, things like that. And you also just see his relationship with actresses over time, and you hear about his difficult relationship with women in general. His movies honestly had so much of his personality in them. Even the writers were told, hey, you need to make a Hitchcock film. You need to write it like Hitchcock would. It's almost like Marvel movies today, how they always have to follow the same style and formula. That's kind of what the Hitchcock brand is. It is a brand. I know I sound like I'm probably praising this movie a lot, but the fault I do have with this movie is a fault that I have with every Hitchcock movie, and that is the ending. So at the end, we find out Norman Bates is the killer, and then the doctors are giving this whole expositional dialogue dump about his condition and what's going on with him and his past and blah, 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 blah. And it just feels like, really? Like, that's how you're going to wrap it up? Hitchcock was never the strongest at sticking the landing for his films. The setup and then the middle was always great, but the ending, they were just never that strong compared to the rest of the films. I don't know why that was, but it just felt like, oh, the movie just has to end here. You know, we just have to like end the movie because it's almost 2 hours. The best thing about the ending is Anthony Perkins, the final shot of him as the camera is zooming in on his face. He has a super creepy smile forming, and it's obviously super iconic in the world of cinema. That is really effective in that last shot, but the rest of the ending is just kind of like, eh. That being said, the rest of the movie is great. It is one of the best horror movies ever made. I'm going to give the movie 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode of 31 Days of Horror.